All right, everyone. We're here today with Joe Walker, who is the host of the Joe Walker podcast, which is undoubtedly one of the best podcasts in the world. And we're very grateful that he's here. So thank you for being here, Joe.
Thanks so much for having me.
So my first question is, you ask very good questions. And I'm wondering, why do most interviewers not do that? What's the reason? Is it lack of respect for the audience, lack of curiosity, or something else?
Oh, I think good questions are largely informed by good research, and most interviewers just have better things to do with their time than a lot of research. That would be one thing. Another thing is a lot of shows are appealing to broader audiences for whom really incisive, nuanced questions may not necessarily be the thing they want, like the product they're looking for. So I guess I'm trying to at least trying to appeal to a very rarefied audience. I suppose also podcasting has kind of democratized question asking, and so you'll see more and more over the coming years interviewers popping up around the world, kind of asking better and better questions, and all kind of like pushing each other in that direction.
On the point about respect for the audience, do you think that has something to do with it at all? Do you think it's kind of assuming a certain set of knowledge on the part of your audience, and that's a crucial difference, or do you really just think it's about broad appeal versus, time constraints for research and so on?
I think the time constraints is probably the more dominant factor, especially
Okay.
with today's journalism, where the business model is broken. So in the past, the kind of rivers of gold that, for example, newspapers derived from classifieds could then be used to cross-subsidize really deep investigative journalism. Whereas today, you're just going for like clicks and you're trying to minimize costs because the internet has I guess, like taken those sources of income away from mainstream media. And so the people who in the past used to ask the questions, kind of just like sitting at the desk, bashing out an opinion or doing like as little research as possible because that's what the business model dictates. And people like me who try and do as much research as possible and think about how to craft questions as carefully as possible, have to think of like different ways of funding that, and that's hard.
One thing I'm definitely curious about is how like LLMs and AI in general is going to change podcasting and maybe the research process as well.
Yeah, I haven't thought too much about what this looks like in, say, 5, 10 years' time, but at least at the moment, I mean, it's certainly a staple part of my research process, but I mean, in a way that it would be the same part of anyone's creative process, whether you're writing like a blog article or an essay or researching for, like a new startup you're building. So for me, I guess if I'm trying to learn a new discipline or field as part of the background preparation for a podcast interview, often I'm pulling myself up by my bootstraps using GPT-4. So there'll be like a bunch of, say I'm learning about nuclear physics or whatever to interview Richard Rhodes, there'll be a bunch of terms of art that are unfamiliar to me. And as I'm reading other sources like books or journal articles, I'll be plugging those words into GPT-4 to get definitions for myself and furnish myself with context. That's how I use it at the moment. I guess that's how I'm going to continue using it. I guess, as I said, that's how I think many people use it in other contexts. But yeah, I don't have clear thoughts on what this looks like for podcasters specifically in 5 or 10 years. I don't know if you guys have thought about this, but I'd be curious to hear if you have.
What I'd be curious to see is like an AI Jamie, like Jamie from the Joe Rogan podcast, where you could like
pull that up.
Say, yeah, exactly, yeah. You could have an AI agent listening, and then you could just shout stuff at it while you're doing the podcast, and it would do some research and pull stuff up for you.
Yeah,
I thought that'd be really cool.
Pull that up, Sydney.
Yeah, exactly.
It might also help with follow-up questions. See, that would be interesting. Yeah. On the note of follow-up questions, you believe very strongly in that as a portion of the interview and the value of that. And I was just curious on this topic of spaced repetition, has the knowledge that you've remembered with that made you more fluid in the conversation so you can more easily ask good follow-up questions that are relevant to their expertise? What's been your experience there?
Yeah, it has, definitely. It also, I think there are actually potentially two things happening here. One is that you've memorized stuff better, so you're in a better position to ask the follow-up questions. The second is that, I don't know whether this is the case for you guys, but certainly I've found this to be true in my experience. The spaced repetition memory practice becomes a kind of talisman where if I've done it before an interview, I feel some kind of placebo effect, like I've internalized the knowledge better than I would have otherwise, which I probably have. But even if I hadn't, there's that feeling, that aura of confidence, which makes me more willing to ask the follow-up question as well.
As if you have all the relevant facts at hand, you just have that feeling, right? That makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
that's interesting. I remember in your interview with Andy, the episode called, I think it was Intellectual Exoskeletons, which is a really badass name for a podcast, by the way.
Thank you.
But he mentioned like one of the effects of doing spaced repetition is that you go from feeling that you are someone who doesn't know very much about the subject to, having done the flashcards and the spaced repetition practice, you start to see yourself as a student of the subject, and it gives you that it's like a self-identity change in a way that makes you more confident in a way. And I remember also that you mentioned in the podcast with, I've forgotten her name, I think it was a microbiologist,
Catalin Carrico.
That
one was amazing, by the way. Amazing podcast.
But you mentioned in your interview with DJ, when he was interviewing you, that you felt like you didn't actually have that deep knowledge about microbiology or anything like that. So do you feel like SRS can have that kind of downside where it sounds like you know what you're talking about, but you don't really, in a sense? I guess it made sense for that podcast. You're not a professional microbiologist. You just need to get the basics. But that's something that people often say with SRS, because you're memorizing things, you're not actually getting that deep knowledge. What's been your experience?
Well, for that podcast with Catalin Carrico, I had been writing notes, but I hadn't actually had time to use the SRS. So I guess that's not quite an example there. Or maybe that's like a negative example. I think SRS done well doesn't have to look like you being a stochastic parrot, so to speak. Like, as long as you kind of like really get to the bottom of things and keep asking why, and make sure you're like thinking well and writing really good atomic notes that feed into the SRS, like that can surely help mitigate that problem that you raised. But yeah, I mean, it is a classic problem. I think, as I said, the solution is to think better.
Mm-hmm.
In that podcast episode with her, this is a very niche question. How did you find out when the word stress started being applied to human beings? That seemed like such a very specific fact to me, and I was curious about that.
Yeah, I don't remember. I probably just went down some internet rabbit hole, either researching her story, and maybe it got mentioned in like some article that had covered her, or when I realized she was interested in Shale's book, maybe it was on his like Wikipedia page or something.
What did you think about her response when she said that without that book, she wouldn't be where she was because it affected her ability to handle stress so much?
I remember feeling a little bit skeptical. She seemed to me like someone who's just like really naturally optimistic, and I don't know this for sure, but I feel like disposition is just highly genetic. So even if she hadn't encountered that book, like she still would have been the optimist and the resilient person that she is today. But she sounded adamant about it in the podcast. She was like, no question, I wouldn't be here today talking to you. So it is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I found that very interesting because of how young, she seemed to have internalized the lessons of the book. If it was from the book, she had internalized it before she had exited high school, which I thought was just kind of a
Right,
strange ability to integrate that.
right.
On the topic of optimism, you've had like a lot of high-profile optimists on your podcast. I mean, for example, David Deutsch and Steven Pinker. You introduced them as like bastions of the Enlightenment, which is coming under attack from the pessimists. I'm wondering if you've considered having based Beth Jesus, the most recent kind of kind of bastion of the Enlightenment, techno accelerationist, leader of the effective accelerationist movement. I wonder if you've got in touch for him to have him on the podcast.
I haven't invited him onto the podcast. Do you guys think he would be a good guest?
I don't have
I
any.
saw he had like a podcast with Lex Friedman recently. I think he
Yeah.
would be a good guest because he is such a interesting figure, divisive figure for a lot of people. So I think it'd be worth having him on. You could definitely ask him some interesting questions for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I also saw parts of the podcast with Lex. I guess I'm just not yet convinced that there is much intellectual substance to the EAC movement. And I say this as someone who kind of vibes with it or is sympathetic to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm not sure what my audience would get out of it.
Mm.
But I should think about that more. It's possible that I'm not being open-minded enough about that idea.
Yeah, I kind of agree with the vibes thing because the vibes are very similar to what would be kind of what's encouraged by the sort of Deutsch's worldview. So there's an overlap there in terms of trying to accelerate the technological development. That kind of overlaps with what Deutsch espouses in his philosophy, where we want to accelerate the production of knowledge as much as possible. But obviously, it has, as its intellectual foundation, it kind of has what I could only describe as like a lot of jargon and stuff that I just couldn't understand. It seemed to be justified from very like low principle physics stuff. Whereas if you read like The Beginning of Infinity, it's a dense book, but it's understandable, and you come away feeling like you've uncovered something and you've understood something quite deeply. Whereas I didn't get that impression from reading the EAC kind of stuff.
Yeah, I agree.
I want to change topics a bit. You mentioned that you found the book, The Undoing Project, emotionally moving. I think you mentioned that you actually teared up at the end of it, and I actually felt the same way about it. And I was wondering how your feelings changed about the book when Danny revealed that in that end of the book, Michael had materially altered what was really quite important dialogue for one of the final conversations between Danny and Amos.
Firstly, it's a great book. Like it's almost written like a movie. The way he goes through the different scenes and like them going back to Israel to fight in the war in the 1970s and just the narrative arc. Like the fact that he could turn two academic psychologists into an entertaining Michael Lewis style book is some kind of achievement in itself. But
Certainly.
having said that, obviously he sacrificed some accuracies for his journalistic narrative. So even before the conversation with Kahneman, I felt like he treated Gerd Gigerenzer really unfairly. I had Gerd on the podcast several years ago, maybe in like 2020, and he kind of frames Gerd as like the villain in the story because he needs, I guess, like an antithesis to Kahneman and Tversky's thesis, but in a way that's just like entirely unfair in my opinion. That was one thing, and then there was that revelation from Kahneman that Lewis had omitted his response to Amos when Amos said, "Of all the people in my life, you've caused me the most pain," and Kahneman said, "Ditto." And I guess Lewis wanted Kahneman to be the kind of softer, more sensitive character, and Amos to be the like harder, tougher character, and that's why he did that. I guess it's just a reminder that you should take these kind of like journalistic narratives with a grain of salt. And yeah, always
Yeah, do you
remember
think
that.
in general the, I guess you might call it the Gell-Mann amnesia effect, is underrated when it comes to books, nonfiction books,
I
or
think so. Yeah,
underemphasized?
yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so for sure. Like if that is true of like if those inaccuracies or storytelling kind of embellishments are true of the Undoing Project, then maybe there are similar inaccuracies in Lewis's other books.
Mm. Yeah, well, I don't want to get into it, but I just found it strange the way that Michael had emphasized that moment in interviews about the book. He had mentioned that moment explicitly, and he quotes the dialogue wrong intentionally over and over, and I just found that kind of strange. It does not seem to me that Richard Rhodes would ever put anything like that in his books. So I do think there's a distinction there.
Yeah, I didn't actually know that he had doubled down on it in interviews.
Yeah, he always says, and he says this multiple times, and I feel compelled to mention it, even though I like Michael. It's just, I think it's an important thing to mention because a lot of these popular nonfiction books, they have to be filled with inaccuracies. And, we just take it as sort of factual when maybe it isn't.
Mm,
Anyway.
right.
In your recent podcast with Stephen and David Deutsch, David made a very interesting statement about AGIs. He said AGIs will be people and they will have rights, and causing them to perform huge computations for us will be slavery. I'm very curious to get your thoughts on this. Should we be preparing for a slave revolt?
Wow, I mean, there's just like so many dependencies within that question. I don't know. So the first thing to note is David has a very idiosyncratic vocabulary, as you will know, as someone who's read the beginning of Infinity. And in his terminology, people, quote unquote, are things that are capable of creating new knowledge or new explanations. And that's why AGIs, in theory, fit under his definition of people. But whether that also means that they are sentient in a morally relevant sense, that would imply that having them work for us is some kind of slavery. I don't know. I don't think we can answer that right now. What do you think?
Well, I think that if they were sentient, then it would be extremely cruel to make them perform Google searches for us and things like that.
I agree. I agree.
But yeah, it's one of the parts of his philosophy that I struggle with a lot. That and the universal explainers thing, I think, are quite difficult to wrap your head around and make sense of.
Yeah.
This
actually seems to be sorry, I was just going to say, there seems to be like a bit of a blind spot in moral philosophy at the moment. Like, hopefully there'll be a lot more interesting dissertations published over the next few years about the ethics of AGI agents.
I actually think it's a huge opportunity for someone out there, some moral philosopher, to make it an enormous like impact and create a huge legacy for themselves. If they can be the person, like say AGI is developed, and you could be the person who creates like the legal framework for AGIs to be seen on the same level as just like a human. I think you'd be like Jesus 2.0 pretty much in terms of your like historical moral significance. So if anyone's listening to this and is a moral philosopher, get on it.
Is there any consensus on how to even determine if there is sentience within the AGI?
I don't know.
The only reasonable one I've heard is from Ilya Sutskever about basically removing all terms relating to self-awareness and consciousness or anything even remotely close from its training data. And then we have a conversation with it about if it feels anything or what it's like. And then if it begins to articulate those feelings despite not having any training about it, then that would be evidence that it had become conscious?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I feel like I would still not be fully satisfied that it was like truly sentient. But
Right.
that is interesting. I hadn't heard
Yeah,
that.
that to me seems like the hard problem of it in terms of dealing with things that seem sentient. How do you even know if it is or if it's just manifesting it? And at some level, is it even worth making that distinction? If it's manifesting all
Right.
the behaviors of suffering, what do you care whether it actually is? Maybe.
Yeah, exactly. And surely Ilias anticipated that objection. I wonder whether he had anything more to say on that.
Yeah, maybe he has, and I just haven't heard it.
Maybe that's why
Uh,
he did the coup. Maybe he saw something. That's what everyone's saying on Twitter. What did Ilya see?
I would love to know. I would really love
Yeah.
to know.
We'll have to wait for the Michael Lewis book on that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Bring a spoonful of salt with you. But anyway, one thing I think makes your podcast so great, and in fact, it might be the core of it, is how good of a listener you are, and that's relates to your ability to ask good follow-up questions. And I was wondering, why are you that way? What's your model of it? Did you gain that skill? Were you born that way? How did you become that way?
Well, thank you for the compliment. I've always been a pretty good conversationalist just from having, deep and meaningfuls with mates over the years and such. But the podcast has definitely made me a better listener. I think
Mm,
also this principle, which I think comes from one of those like tacky self development books, but it's like first seek to understand, then to be understood. I think this
mm,
might be from the Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. But I really, I think, internalized that by doing the podcast over the years. That before you have your say, like make sure you actually understand what the other person's argument or position is.
mm, mm. Have you read any of Carl Rogers' work about developing active listening as a skill?
No,
He's
what
the
are his original insights?
he's a 20th century humanist psychologist. I'm not super familiar with his work, but he talks a lot about developing this skill of listening and stemming the internal monologue such that you can focus on what you're being told instead of how you're wanting to respond or defending yourself, those kinds of things. A lot of it's
Oh,
obviously in a
interesting.
psychotherapy context, so it's about, not being able to defend yourself, let's say, until you're able to restate your opponent's or your counterpart's argument in a way that they would be satisfied with. So that's kind of rationalist steel manning things, but he talks about it as like an active skill to develop, just a cognitive skill of listening and not being interrupted by your own monologue.
Interesting. There's another
Hmm.
book in a similar vein which came out last year. I can't properly recommend it yet because I haven't finished reading it, but it's the David Brooks book. I think the title is like How to Know a Person.
Oh yes, I've been meaning to read that as well.
Yeah, I've read a few pages and it's quite good on this.
Hmm. On the topic of books, actually, I wanted to ask you, you've talked about this book, The Powers of Two, or maybe it's just called Powers of Two,
Yeah.
and you've said that the book is not very good. So what's wrong with the book, and what's a better book about that topic?
It's kind of bloated and it gets some things wrong or it uses some pairs in, I think, inappropriate ways. So like for example, one of the pairs he discusses is Van Gogh and his brother Theo, but I don't think they actually constitute a true creative dyad. Theo
Mm,
was Van Gogh's brother. He was like an art uh, dealer. He basically funded Van Gogh's um, life so that he could be an
right.
artist. Gave him a lot of encouragement, but I don't think he was like the kind of creative partner I'm contemplating. The closest Van Gogh got to that was Gauguin in the famous Yellow House in the south of France, just before he cut his
Mm,
ear off. He had like a live-in partnership with another artist for a few months. So there are some examples like that where I think it's kind of, yeah, just a bit ill-disciplined in its analysis. I don't think I have one alternative better book, but I have like a bunch of them that I've been reading because I'm trying to write an essay on this topic. So let me think. What are some of the better ones I've read? There's a really nice book called uh, Tete a Tete about the relationship between Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre. Um, The Double Helix by Jim Watson, classic. Also, less well known, but just as insightful around their partnership is Francis Crick's autobiography. I can't remember its title, but it's his only autobiography. That's really good. The stuff on Marie Curie and Pierre Curie, their daughter wrote a biography of Marie, which is quite good on their partnership. Actually, here we go. This is probably the one thing. Michael Farrell's book, Collaborative Circles. If you
Collaborative
want like
circles.
collaborative circles, yeah, if you want like a rigorous, fairly academic treatment of the topic, it's not about pairs per se, it's about small creative groups, but the pair is an important part of the analysis. And I would even argue that the pair is like the operative part of the group, and the group is kind of just like a vehicle for the pair. Because what you often find in these creative pairs, including the ones that Michael Farrell studied, is that they break off and do their most. Sorry, the group forms, and then people break off into pairs where they do their most creative work. So he studies 6 different case studies, including like the Inklings, which famously included Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, but also the French Impressionists. That was like Bazille and Monet and Renoir, and another guy. So that's a fantastic book, and I actually spent a couple of days with Michael in Rochester, New York, in November of last year, talking about
Is there
this.
going to be an episode with him?
Potentially, yeah.
That'd be great. What
Yeah.
got you interested in dyads in the first place?
It kind of came up organically in so many different podcast conversations, and then it seemed really important to me, and it seemed like no one had done a great treatment on it. So I thought, like, okay, here's an opportunity to have some kind of counterfactual value add. On top of that, I guess, like in my day job at a tech startup, I had like a really close colleague, our COO, and we became kind of like a pair of a kind, and had like a really great working relationship, solved a lot of problems together. So I suppose I also had that like personal experience as well, which makes the idea way more vivid and visceral.
In your research and personal experience, like what makes a really good creative partnership?
So typically there is some kind of complementarity. Often, but not always, it's like a creative, technical complementarity. So, for example, Kahneman was the way more intuitive, generative thinker. Then Tversky tidied up his ideas with the precision and the mathematics. Another example might be, let's see, I mean, if you take Lennon and McCartney as a dyad, like McCartney's kind of like the manager, Lennon is like the artist. Obviously, that's not like a perfect characterization because McCartney is also quite creative, but usually one person plays more of the role than the other, and vice versa. That's one thing, but complementarities aren't a sufficient explanation because you can have complementarities in groups of 3 or more. In fact, you can have like even more combinations and more complementarities. So there's got to be like some other special factor about the dyad. And I think it has something to do with the intimacy of the dyad. So in some sense, 2 is not a group. And like, I guess we kind of know this intuitively when we recall idioms like third wheeling or 2's company, but 3's a crowd. when we celebrate like power couples. Like there's something much more intimate about a twosome in contrast to the sort of like politics and coordination problems that kick in for like ever larger groups. And so I think that's got something to do with it. And to, I guess, like come back to your original question, James, one other thing apart from complementarities that characterizes a lot of successful pairs is they always start in friendships, and then the work kind of grows within that context. So they're never really like manufactured in a kind of artificial way. They start from emotional bonds where, if you wanted to get psychoanalytic about it, the partners are kind of seeing each other as idealized self objects, which I think is like a Freudian concept that Michael Farrell talks about. So like there was a way in which Kahneman and Tversky really loved each other platonically, and I think that happens first, and that's like somehow a really important element as well, and seems much more unique to a pair than to any other kind of group size.
That's
so can
really
you think
interesting.
of a good exception? Do you know of any great exceptions where three or more people have persisted for a long time in some creative endeavor and had good output?
So many. And to be like clear, the claim isn't that the only way to do great work is through pairs. I guess the question I'm exploring is like, when or in what context the pair is the optimal creative unit. Maybe one way of like thinking about optimal group size is in like Kuhnian kind of terms. So when you're trying to create a new paradigm or make a leap of intuition, like pairs can be much more fruitful in that endeavor. But when you're just like harvesting all of the insights within an existing paradigm, or like normal science, as I think Kuhn puts it, then you need larger and larger group sizes. If only because like things just get like way more technical, and you need, say, within the context of science, like big scientific teams.
Right.
But yeah, it's not an either or in terms of the group size. The other thing I would say is like sometimes people are better off alone. Not everyone should is capable of working in a pair or a group of three or more. For example, maybe Newton was just like better off alone because he seems like a pretty disagreeable character. If I had to break it down by field or discipline, it seems that the one field that can get away without like dyads or group work is mathematics. There's like the famous example of Andrew Wiles, who just labored in isolation for 7 years working on, was it Fermat's last theorem?
Yes.
I mean, maybe counterfactually he could have done it more quickly if he had the right partner, but that he could even do that at all, I think, is unique to mathematics, where the rules and the axioms are much clearer that you can do solo work, whereas in other fields, even physics, everything's way fuzzier, and you need that confidential criticism from a partner or criticism from the broader community of scientists, or whatever the case may be, to help hone and refine your work.
Do you think it's plausible that it's also due to the types of personalities that mathematics work attracts, and they're just more inclined to work alone?
Yes, but I think that is true, but it's also the case that like that's neither necessary nor sufficient. I think it's also the case that the mathematics is a special discipline where the rules and axioms are just like really clear to every individual, and so you can't kind of like wander off down some path of intellectual folly. You're always kind of kept within these guardrails.
Right.
Whereas in other disciplines, people need to be those guardrails.
Mm. One like kind of weird suggestion I have, if you're interested in this, group sizes and knowledge creation, would be to look
Yeah,
at the like animal breeding literature, because if you think about it, it's kind of a similar problem, especially if you view it through Deutsch's worldview of knowledge being not just like the knowledge we create ourselves, like explanatory knowledge. It also includes like genetic knowledge, which is non-explanatory, but it's still knowledge. So if you have
right.
like animal breeders, they want to create like subherds within their um, group of animals, and breed them
Yeah,
together in order to get certain characteristics. That's like the essence of artificial selection. And depend like how you specify the group size can be very important, because if you have too large a group size, you're going to average out the genetic diversity. You're not going to be
Mm,
able to create enough and like create and maintain enough like weird genetic variation in there. But if you have it too small, then your breeding takes forever. Uh, so that might be
mm,
just like an interesting thing to look into. um, but I had a
that's
question
great.
about.
I think, sorry, just on that quickly, I think
Yeah, sure.
um, Joe Henrik and Michael Mutakrishna have some great work that possibly connects to this analogy. Um,
Oh, sweet.
but just before your next question, I guess like one final thought on this, given that you mentioned David Deutsch, we could view all of this in Popperian terms as well. So maybe in the dyad, like one person is providing the conjectures and the other person is providing the
Mm,
refutations. They're just like
yeah.
embodied in different people at various times.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Mm. Um, yeah, I had a question along the same topic. It was about Michael Nielsen's book, Reinventing Discovery. I don't know if you've read that,
Hmm.
but in
I'm
it,
aware of it, but I haven't read it.
yeah, it's very related to this topic of like finding the group size for maximum creativity and knowledge creation and things like that. But in it, he talks about this term scenius, which is like genius,
Yep.
but for communities and things.
Yeah.
And
It's Kevin
um,
Kelly's coinage, isn't it?
yeah, I think so. And what Michael Nielsen is thinking about in that book is like how you can design an environment in which scenius arises. So, for example, in which dyads can sort of come together and become creative partners and have like really prolific creative output. I wonder if you've thought about that at all. Like, how can you design an environment? Is it even possible to design, or does it purely have to rely on kind of serendipity uh, to happen?
It's a great question, and this is something I've been thinking about recently. So I think you can try and create conditions that foster scenius. Um, but then the next step of groups or dyads forming, that has to be kind of organic. And I think you can like do things to reduce the friction, but you can't just like you can't just force people together. And it goes back to that point I made about like a lot of these successful dyads seem to begin in friendship. Um,
Mm.
One of the interesting things in Michael Farrell's work is that a lot of the creative circles spring up like on the peripheries of different fields where there is an imbalance in the number of apprentices relative to masters. So, taking the French Impressionists, for example, in the 1860s in Paris, there were so many novices moving to France to learn, to Paris rather, to learn art, and so few masters that all of the apprentices got paired off with masters, leaving a big group of apprentices with no masters. And those apprentices just formed collaborative circles, and that's how the French Impressionists began. Kind of just, I guess, like a group of just like lost boys. Um,
Mm.
and so that might be one thing to consider is like um, if these groups form on the peripheries where there's like an oversupply of apprentices relative to masters, so to speak, um, is that something that should inform how we kind of like design seniors? I think also there's a lot of there's a lot of growth of like online communities as well, with which is something that can help. And they're not mutually exclusive with like forming those bonds of friendship or those small groups. They're kind of just like a starting point. And then you can transfer that from like online to in real life, those relationships. Um, but yeah, so this is a bit stream of consciousness because I don't have like fully formed thoughts on this yet. But those are that's like a smattering of ideas that might be relevant to a question. But yeah, I guess the most important one is like helping to create more focal points or magnet places where people can come.
On a somewhat related topic, you got Emergent Ventured from Tyler Cowen. I was wondering, what was it like to be interviewed by him, and what have you learned from Tyler about talent?
So, this is an interesting story for you, but I was not, in fact, interviewed by him, and I didn't really go through the normal application process. So, around about the 3rd or 4th of January of last year, I emailed him and basically said, given what you already know about me, would you be happy to approve a grant, or should I submit an application? And he replied saying that there might be things that he doesn't know about me that I would like to share with him that would be relevant, and I could do that through the standard application portal or by email. And so I replied with like a longish email of like all the things I thought would be important for him to know that I was pretty sure he didn't know, because I kind of, I guess, sensed an opportunity based on his response. And I think I would have sent that. Like, he replied really quickly, as he likes to do. And I probably sent my response back a couple of hours later. So maybe this is like, I don't know, 2 a.m. my time on the 4th of January. And then he approved it like pretty quickly after that, an hour or so later. So that was probably a non-traditional. Well, I have no idea. Maybe a lot of people don't go through the normal application process, but that was my case. What have I learned from Tyler about talent? Man, it's hard to separate what Tyler specifically taught me from the ideas I was.
Yeah, let's just say Tyler and Daniel, if you want to include him as well.
Yeah, even Daniel as well. I think, let's see. I mean, there are a few different, I guess, like tactical things. So for like older folks, look at their like revealed preference or track record. For younger folks, look at things like their energy, their rate of improvement, how well they write. I guess I'm coming at this from almost like the perspective of someone hiring or identifying talent. But it might also be interesting to think about this from the perspective of like, how do you develop your own talent? I think one thing I've learned is just to be way more ambitious than I already was. And that's definitely something I picked up from Tyler.
Do you think that there's a scalable way to increase people's ambitions?
Oh man, it's such a good question. I don't think so. Like, so what works with Tyler is that it's Tyler who's given you the kind of tick of approval, so to speak.
Right.
And that's very flattering and empowering because he has this aura or reputation of being a great judge of talent. And so that kind of raises your self-confidence, raises your ambitions beyond what they already were. So you'd need other people like Tyler, and I think those people are very scarce. So I'm not sure how scalable this model is.
Does it work at all to just expose people to other people that are doing great things? Or do you think that's roughly ineffectual model?
No, I think that works. I think that works. I guess that's a separate thing though, right?
I guess so. I've been wondering if the internet has raised ambition on average, or at least for the right type of person, because you can see people beyond your local town. You know, maybe there's somebody who doesn't have very many
Mm.
ambitious people around them, but now they can see people on the internet doing more things. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's truth to that. I would be surprised if it hadn't raised ambition. But having said that, there still feels to be something irreplaceable about someone you know personally believing in you. So
Yeah, I think
you're not watching Michael Jordan interviews on YouTube, but it's like a real person, even if it's just in a virtual context, like investing some kind of faith in you.
Mm.
Hmm.
I think it probably works even for people that are not maybe as known as Tyler for being sharp judges of talent. If you just tell maybe a younger person in your life, like, hey, you've got it. If you try really hard, you can do something. I think that might
Yeah,
work.
Yeah,
yeah, I agree.
I think there's definitely been a recent example that I think is related. There was the young kid, maybe 13 years old, who beat Tetris for the first time, and what
I didn't
happened
see that.
immediately? Yeah, yeah. Apparently, this is some huge achievement. It hasn't ever been done before. You have to play
Wow,
for an extremely long time, and he's the first guy ever to do it. And
that's amazing.
what you saw immediately afterwards was a whole bunch of people were able to do it. Once they'd seen that it was possible,
Right.
they were immediately able then to go on and do it themselves. And it's similar, I think, with was it the 5 minute mile? One
4 minute.
person, 4 minute mile. Someone cracks it, and then you see, like, in the next year, 5 to 10 more people are able to do it. So once you see that something is possible, and this is becoming easier and easier, obviously, because we're also online and everything so interconnected,
Right.
everyone else is then able to do it as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I've been thinking
One
about
other,
this a little bit recently in the context of like national cultures of innovation. So I've been thinking a little bit about like how could Australia become a more innovative place, a more
Mm.
entrepreneurial place? And I think part of it is just having those role models or those examples, like really successful exited founders.
Yeah, I think a big part of it as well is probably like having a culture that's very optimistic, because this is something that I see in the UK as well. Like, I'm really interested in AI and like large language models and the developments around that. And I go on Twitter, for example, and I see the activity and the energy in California, where Sander is, and I feel a lot of FOMO because I'm sitting here in Oxford, and it's been very difficult to find other people who are uh, interested in that kind of thing, but also
mm,
people who are actually optimistic about the future and feel like AI can be used for great good. I mean, Oxford itself is like the heart of the EA movement, the effective altruist
Mm-hmm.
movement, and so it has big AI safety kind of organizations here, and it feels like that the existence of those organizations kind of squashes down the other side of the coin, which is like using AI to build and to advance society. At least that's my
Mm.
impression. So I wonder if there's a way to create more optimism in society, and if that's like a route to um powering uh innovation in Australia or UK.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. I feel like if we take that Peter Thiel matrix of like definite and indefinite and then optimistic and pessimistic, Australia's maybe more like indefinitely optimistic. We
Mm.
call it like the she'll be right attitude. It's just like maybe it's like a corollary of the resources curse where we've just been like endowed with all these minerals which we dig up and sell to China, but like it hasn't really created any selection pressures on our institutions to be more innovative. But there's just this sense that yeah, like everything will be fine. Maybe another example is like Australians are some of the worst gamblers in the world. Like put way more money through the pokies than almost any other country. I feel like
Wow.
that's a symptom of this just vague sense that everything will be fine.
Mm,
Hmm.
that's very
So we're
interesting.
optimistic, but in like a really indefinite way.
If I could ask maybe one last question, I know we gotta wrap it up soon, but I have to know this. I'm so curious about this. You mentioned that you and the developer for your website optimized it for converting guests rather than listeners. So that way when you
Yeah.
outreach through email, it has a higher conversion rate. I'm wondering, is one of the changes you made using photos of the faces as thumbnails? And if so, what's the logic of that? And what are the other changes you made?
So I guess the using faces as thumbnails was just like a separate design decision on my part. But that was probably more with the audience in mind, although I guess it works for both. But in terms of the website homepage, I guess it's just like way more heavy on the social proof, um, that I would be a good forum for discussing your ideas if you're a prospective
Mm,
guest. So there's like quotes from other guests. Um,
right. Okay.
but I'm not, I mean, I guess when I think about it, I'm not sure the trade-off is that strict necessarily. I'm not sure how
Yeah.
different
Probably.
the homepage would look if I was optimizing for listeners.
Mm,
Mm.
I guess
But
in the
anyway,
end, you're
certainly
just highlighting the good
that was
parts of
our
it.
intention.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, you mentioned you know, focusing on the conversion rate of your of the website, and also from your what you mentioned about Tyler and the Emergent Ventures grant, you've obviously got a great ability to write cold emails, and you
Yeah.
said in your interview with DJ as well that the conversion rate on your emails to potential guests is like around 50%, which I thought was pretty spectacular. I was wondering if you had any advice for people who are who want to find like opportunities for themselves. Maybe they're not going the traditional route. What can they do to improve their cold email?
Yeah. I'm very happy to talk about this. So maybe I'll give three pieces of advice. The the first is to have empathy with the person you're contacting. So be conscious of the fact that their time is probably limited. They have no idea who you are. They're looking for value out of this interaction, and therefore that means you need to like get to the point, show that you're like a normal, nice, non-needy person, and all of that should shine through in your copy. Um, like your word choices, just the number of words. So you should have a preference for brevity. Sound like a normal person. The second point would be persistent and thoughtful with your
Mm.
follow-ups. So many of my guests have ghosted me or never even replied to my opening gambit, but then have later agreed to come on the show because like several weeks or several months later, I've sent just like a very short follow-up note. So persistence is key with cold emailing. And then what would be my third piece of advice? I think keep iterating your copy as well. So I I send like a slightly different version of my email every few emails, and then just like continue tweaking what works. So I'm like, I guess like very willing to overturn something that I've been using for a long time and not get too wedded to like a particular like template that I've been using.
Hmm. Just one last question. Do you think this advice applies to women as well? Like brevity, persistence, and iterating on your copy. I guess your copy could be your pickup line, maybe.
Yeah, I actually think that there are like a lot of resonances between, I guess, like dating advice and cold emailing advice. The one that stands out to me the most is conveying non-neediness. So,
Mm.
like, hey, I'm a cool, interesting person. It would be great if we had this opportunity to speak with each other for these reasons. It's not like, g'day, popping up here in your inbox. I need this from you. Like, these are the things
Right.
I want from you. You have no
Yeah.
idea who I am, but I want your time.
Right.
That is like much less likely to be successful.
Yeah, I have no
See.
skills, but I'll work for free.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
One piece of advice that I think applies to both domains is to just do it in the first place. More people are receptive to it than you might guess.
Mhm.
Actually, that is a fantastic piece of advice, and I should have added that to my list.
Hmm.
Kind of tying back into this earlier segment of the conversation about seeing great role models and more people being inspired to achieve great things. I think there is a lack of competition at the top. So a lot of people just write themselves off to begin with because they think like this person would never speak to me. Um, they're too busy, too important. I'm nothing. But if everyone else is thinking like that, there's a fallacy of composition. And if you just send the cold email, like you're already taking your chances from zero to, non-zero. And that's something. So yeah, I think it's really good advice. Like
Mm.
nothing ventured, nothing gained. Send the cold email. Doing
Yeah.
it at all is better than nothing. And once you get a little bit good at it, it's a superpower.
Absolutely.
And Twitter
Well,
DMs as well.
for sure. Yeah, I
Yeah, for
think
sure.
any domain, and especially if you're not asking for a big commitment, you'll be surprised by the hit rate. It might even be higher than 50%. It depends on what you're asking.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, all right, let's wrap it up there. I think we covered a lot of ground there. I'm very happy that you were able to join us. Thank you so much for being here, man.
Yeah, thank you, Joe.
Thank you for the invite. And it was a lot
And
of fun. It's not every day I get to have these kind of conversations with people and talk about such interesting questions.
yeah, I just
awesome.
want to remind everybody, please, if you have not heard Joe's podcast, you will not regret it. Just find an episode, listen to it, no matter who it is. He asks very incisive questions, so you'll enjoy that. So thank you again, Joe.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, James.